So once you've finished your midterm composition project, it's important to understand how artists and musicians share their music once they have created it in their DAWs or their digital audio workstations. So Soundtrap is a DAW or a digital audio workstation, but there are lots of other kinds out there. GarageBand is a popular one that is actually installed on our computers at school. And GarageBand comes as a piece of software anytime that you buy an Apple desktop or laptop computer. You may have seen GarageBand as an app on your phone or on your iPad, but the GarageBand app actually works under a different programming language than the desktop and laptop version. So they're not exactly the same. But there are other DAWs out there such as Logic Pro, Pro Tools, Ableton Live, lots of different DAWs that are out there. Now, and Soundtrap is one of those. DAWs are also known as what are called sequencers. And if you think about what a sequence is, a sequence is a stated order of things. So, for example, I've mentioned before, your phone number would be a sequence of numbers. The alphabet works on a sequence. If you ever had a combination locks work on a sequence of numbers. So a sequence is anything that is a specific order of like instructions. Recipes are sequences. So if you ever are going to bake a cake, you can't start by putting the cake in the oven. There's other steps that you have to do first before you get to that last step. So that's what a sequence is. So in music, as we're working in a DAW, what we're doing with the DAW is actually giving it a set of instructions. So if I took this project and kind of zoomed in, essentially what we're looking at is a graphic representation of the instructions that we're given to the computer. So, for example, it's like we're saying, okay, computer, I want you to play this sound effects loop along with this drum loop first, and I also want you to add a fade in to the drum loop. Now, at this point, we're going to add this sound, and then at this point, we add this one, and then this one, and this one. So, and it just kind of continues on till we get here. Now at measure 9, I want to play these 4 tracks simultaneously, and we're going to repeat those tracks 4 times. Now over here, we're going to have a new track, and then we're going to loop that track 4 times, and so on and so forth. So when you work in a sequencer, what the computer basically is doing is compiling a list of instructions, or it's putting together like a recipe that we give it for creating the sound in the order and in the sequence and with the various effects and things that we can add to it. Now, the thing about sequencing software, as these software files create what are called index files, and the index file is literally like a list of the instructions in computer language that we've given it here in the DAW. Now, the great thing about these index files is that we can edit those files. So at any point as we're putting a song together, we can change the recipe. We can change the instructions that were given the sequencer, how we want those sounds to be played. So the sequencing software is great because it allows us to edit and change and record and move things around as we're putting our songs together. But once we have our song finished, the problem with these DAWs or sequencing software is that in order to hear that music played back, it's got to be played back on that DAW. So the computer language that Soundtrap uses to create its index files is different than the software that GarageBand uses, which is different than the software for Logic Pro or all these others. So these index files created by the sequencers can only be read and interpreted by that same program somewhere else. So this isn't a very practical way to share music, which is ultimately what you want to do after you create music, is share it with people or share it with the world. So one of the things that you have to do with all these different DAWs is that you have to convert the index file that the DAW works on into an audio file. And that process is called bouncing. And so what bouncing does is it takes all of this information that we've given the computer and it puts it into a single audio file. And that audio file can be shared very easily, whether we are listening to iTunes or Spotify, or you want to email an audio file or post something on things like SoundCloud where you can share music, or even email it to family. The process of converting these files into an audio file is what's called bouncing. And it's sort of like taking the cake out of the oven after you've followed the recipe and you've baked it. You started off with all these separate ingredients that you put together and mixed, and then finally, after it cooks, you pull it out and it's a finished product. So that's what those audio files are. And I'm going to show you how to do that in Soundtrap in just a bit. But before we do, there are different kind of audio files that you can export these projects with. The two most common types of files are what are called a Wav file, and the other is what is called an MP3. And they work very differently. So a Wav file is what is considered an uncompressed file. So as you take and enter the audio, particularly if you're recording live sound or real instruments, the Wav file is what's called an uncompressed file. That means when you export it, you're going to have something that is very, very close to the original sound that you recorded. The problem with Wav files is that Wav files tend to be very large files. They take up a lot of data and they take up a lot of room on your storage on your device that you're playing it on. So the other option to a Wav file is what's called an MP3 file. And the MP3 files, what they do is take that information from the DAW and it compresses that file. And the way that it does it is pretty interesting in a lot of ways because, for example, we know that there are certain frequencies that humans have a hard time hearing. So what an MP3 does is it finds all those frequencies that are in a Wav file and it eliminates those files. It also understands that there's some sounds in music that tend to cover up or hide other sounds. So the other sounds that are captured in that Wav file that it senses that the humans aren't going to be able to hear, it eliminates that sound also. So the benefit of an MP3 file is it takes up much less space or much less data than a Wav file does. The drawback is you don't get the same level of sound quality as you would with a Wav file. Most of what we listen to every day is in the form of an MP3. So a lot of times we are missing a lot of the music that's been recorded, whether we realize it or not. And I'll show you an example over here in Garageband. So if you look what I have here, these are two recordings of the same piece of music. The one on the top has been saved as a Wav file. The one on the bottom is the same file as an MP3. So you can literally see if I click on the Wav file up here that the Wav file has a lot of information. It's really dense. If you look up here, you can see how much space it's taking up. But if you look down here where it's been converted into an MP3, like you can literally see there's a lot less information. There's a lot less data that it's capturing. So because it's less data, it's going to take up less space. So MP3s are great because they're much easier to share and they're much easier to store than a Wav file. But they do sound different. So for example, let's take a listen to what this Wav file sounds like. So here it is. Really short example. Now compare that to the MP3, which is the same recording, but it's been compressed. So you hear that's a pretty big difference. Let me do that again. And actually this time I'll put them back to back so you can hear them one after another. First the wave, then the MP3. So a pretty big difference. But the thing about it is, unless you have the Wav file right next to the MP3 file that you can compare it to, it's really hard to kind of notice the difference. But that's what's actually happening. Another way I can show you that is if I actually export these files, which I did. So here's the Wav file that I exported. You can see that in the Wav file format, it took up 2.6 megabytes of memory. So in other words, down here, it's 2,626,198 bytes of memory to create the Wav file. On the other hand, the MP3 version, when I exported it, MP3 only took up 362 kilobytes of memory. So in other words, it's only 362,000 bytes. So it's a pretty big difference. The Wav file is almost, it's probably about 80% bigger than the MP3 file. So when it comes to storage, that is a pretty big difference. Okay, so again, just to review, the pro for the Wav file is that it's uncompressed and it maintains all of the original audio and frequency that you record. The drawback is that the files are really large, which makes them harder to store and harder to share. The MP3 files, the pros are that they're small size files. They're much easier to share, much easier to store. The drawback is you're going to lose some of that audio quality and definition that you get from a Wav file. So now that you have all that